welcome everybody to this session of Life.Examined. We haven't been on here for a little while, but we've got another one coming up now. So we are Life.Examined, and what we do is we help people improve their lives, find meaning in their lives by reflecting on their philosophical ethos. And philosophical ethos is the way that our ethical and our philosophical underpinnings lead us to make decisions in life and interact with the world around us. So that's what we're all about. We run events in Gothenburg and pretty soon in other places as well. So we do live events, and obviously right now we don't do very many live events, so we're going to be doing some online stuff. And I'm Joshua Bronson, and obviously I'm a part of Life.Examined. I'm a philosopher living in Gothenburg, Sweden.
My name is Matthew Nowachek, and I am living in Lund, and I'm working a bit with philosophy and teaching in other projects as well.
And my name is Miriam, and I'm in Gothenburg with my company, a philosophical company where we do philosophical practice. Yes?
So today, I thought what we would focus on is the topic of morality in the midst of the corona crisis. But Miriam, would you like to say a bit about how this is going to look before we dive in?
Yes. So what we like to do is to dare to think aloud and to try new thoughts and see where they take us. So we're going to ask questions, perhaps pose a few statements and see how they feel and what we can draw out from them. We're looking for the wisdom of this, see how we can get wiser about our lives and the future, where we're going as a society. So we're looking specifically at the things that we read in the paper and claims that people make, the scientists and the politicians. What are they saying? What does it mean for us as human beings? What does it say about ethics and how we ought to live and how we should navigate through this situation? So that's what we're doing. Yes, we're philosophizing about Corona. Yes. Matthew, over to you.
All right. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to frame this by giving a concrete example and working through a few reflections on this. Hopefully it's not too long-winded here. But I want to start with a concrete example. In the bathrooms at the school where I work, there's this sign that is hung up. It's a picture of somebody washing their hands with the text in Swedish that translates as "Clean hands save lives." And now when I was in there in the bathroom looking at this sign, I had a ton of questions about what does this statement mean? What is it that is implied in this claim? And I started asking questions about, well, do unwashed hands not save lives? Or maybe could we even go so far as to say that unwashed hands actually kill people? About the same time that I saw this sign, I also was talking to a guy that I know, and he went so far as to imply that if we do not assume the most extreme, severe preventative measures, then we are directly responsible for killing other people. But this claim seems rather odd to me. If we go back to the sign, bear with me for a second as I work through a little bit of logic here. The argument of the sign when I was reading this in the bathroom is something like this. If you wash your hands, then you save lives. You wash your hands, therefore you save lives. Now, the first issue with this is that it's logical. It makes sense. It's a valid argument. But that first premise is a bit strange. If you wash your hands, then you save lives. But there's a second issue here that I think is even more problematic. And there seems to be an implied argument here. And the argument is this. If you wash your hands, then you save lives. If you do not wash your hands, therefore you do not save lives. Now, this is a fallacious argument. It's called the fallacy of denying the antecedent. It's not a logical argument, but there's a really important conflation, I think, in this implied argument that has made its way into our discussion. And it's something like this. Not washing your hands is the same thing as not saving lives, which is the same thing as killing someone. Now, this is interesting, the way that this is made it into the way we talk about the coronavirus, the issues of morality related to it, and not least of all when it's made its way into policy decisions of government. So I thought, therefore, it would be important for us, perhaps now more than ever, to begin to raise some difficult questions and to attempt to bring about some clarity in this issue. So I will throw it back to you two.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, I love how that's like, because signs are really nice, because signs oftentimes try to break things down to like the sort of center of what somebody's trying to say, right? They're trying to communicate something. And that one is quite clearly fallacious, right? Or at least the subtext. And what's interesting is that it only gives you text, washing hands saves lives, which is not enough context, right? I mean, it doesn't tell you, it's not a full argument, because it's just pointing in a direction, right? Right. Because you could flesh it out in various ways that maybe would make it turn out true. So you could say, for example, when conducting surgery in a hospital and your hands have something that you know is dangerous, don't wash your hands before you put your hands in somebody's open body, because then they'll die, right? I mean, so you could create a situation where that might be the case, but
right.
It makes a real sharp connection between those two. Whereas really it's about probabilities perhaps, but it doesn't mention that. Yeah.
It sounds like a watered down version of stay home. And staying home saves lives. So if you're not staying home, but you're going out, you need to wash your hands. So that would make it a sort of, then we can see if that's where it comes from, we can see how, what you lose on the way.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, great you pointed that out, Miriam, because the BBC just recently came out with a video where they make a similar claim. I mean, the title of the video is "Stay at Home to Save Lives."
Yeah.
So it's another version of the same "Wash your hands, saves lives."
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because you can see in sort of colloquial speech, it makes sense. I think people understand it. Like, why should I stay indoors? Well, you should stay indoors because going outside makes it more likely that somebody who has underlying conditions might get coronavirus if you spread it, and then they might die. So I mean, that's like the sort of fleshed out, and so that kind of makes sense. But when you shorten it down to stay home, save lives, it misses something there. And then it is sort of, if I'm hearing what you were saying, Matthew, right, it sort of there creeps in an ethical undertone, which seems problematic, which means if you don't stay home, you're not saving lives, i.e. you're morally responsible for killing, which is a real jump there.
If we take it to the extreme that this guy that I was talking with, that would be his conclusion, right? That's definitely one extreme, that if you do not wash your hands, you are directly responsible for the death of others.
Yeah.
That's a powerful claim.
It sounds a little bit like I remember after 9/11, I lived in New Zealand at the time, and they had demonstrations against the US going into Iraq, a few months later. And lots of people were saying, I think I also said it, that if you don't go to the demonstration, you are, if you don't show support for one side, you are indirectly supporting the other side. Sure. And it sounds like the same argument, doesn't it? A little bit.
Yeah. I mean, there's a moral, there's like sort of ethical guilt being implied if you don't do what's suggested. So it's like, go to the rally, save lives. Wash your hands, save lives. I mean, there's an implication. If you don't do X, then and I guess what's problematic with that, in terms of logic, right, is that for one, it's problematic because it doesn't follow. Right? Like just logically, there's no direct connection between the premise and the conclusion, because washing hands might be one thing which could save a life, but not washing hands is not equivalent to taking a life. Those are not those. There's no direct connection there. Right. So I mean that seems problematic. Besides the fact that you might be able to do other things
to save lives.
Well, both save lives, or in the demonstration situation, right? Maybe you, I don't know, maybe you were a U.S. citizen, you could write a letter to your congressman or something like that, and not go to the demonstration. Right. So you might be able to do something for the end result, saving lives, without doing the first one. Like maybe maybe you live alone and you're not going out, so you don't need to wash your hands.
And I mean, we should be clear here that when I'm reading this sign, I can feel the normative force behind the sign. They're basically, what the sign is saying is wash your hands.
Yeah.
It's like an imperative statement. Do this, wash your hands. And I washed my hands, of course, because I think that's a good thing to do, not to spread the coronavirus through not washing my hands. But if I could back this up a second, I want to throw this question back to you guys. This is super complicated issue here in this simple sign. Can you give me a sense of what the lay of the land is here? What kind of philosophical issues are we looking at in this discussion? What do you guys see in here?
Well, I mean, oh, go ahead, Miriam.
Yeah, I was just thinking responsibility and who's responsible. So the individual, like asking, it's asking the individual to take responsibility. So the authorities are asking the individual to be responsible, and also pointing out how can an individual be responsible. I talk a lot about responsibility, and I kind of I like thinking about responsibility and thinking of how I can be responsible for my own agency and the way I experience my life, for instance, like from a coaching perspective. But I think that is what's going on. So we have authorities who are the ones who are supposed to have the information that we don't have. Yeah.
So when you say responsibility, Miriam, do you mean in the sense of we have a duty to carry out certain actions, such as washing our hands?
That's what the sign is saying. Yes, it's saying you have this duty, do this. Yeah.
And that's interesting, because where do you see that duty coming from? So
right.
So what's behind the duty, do you think, Miriam?
It's the implicit, if you don't, you will kill.
And then that includes the idea that obviously killing is wrong.
Yes.
So is it that kind of a duty? Like there's a fundamental moral law that says you shouldn't kill, and this is one way that you might kill, so you shouldn't do this.
Right.
Yeah, it's like a reinstating the superego situation. You know?
Sure.
I think I see what you're getting at, Josh. But this is fascinating. So if that statement is essentially saying that you are responsible in the society, what that means is you have a duty to wash your hands, and you're asking the question, what stands behind that duty? I think there's a few different ways we could look at this. If we bring in some moral categories here, I mean, one way is to talk about the actual duty itself, not to kill or not to harm. In itself is a value. There's other more consequentialist way of thinking about this. If we want to say that washing your hands will lead to better results in society, less suffering, so on and so forth. Maybe there's also a virtue respect here, and that washing my hands is actually part of developing a certain kind of character or functioning as a certain virtuous person within a community. There's definitely maybe a care ethics argument here. We could talk about that washing your hands is an action that comes out of having regard for maybe the most vulnerable in a society, that has a more emphasis on the social aspect. But I'm not quite sure what's going on here. Maybe it's a mix of all these things.
But that's what's partly problematic with it, right? Is that it's ambiguous. It just makes a connection between washing hands and not not killing, right? Which is an awkward way to put it. Washing your hands and saving lives, put it in a positive sense. But it doesn't make the further connection. Well, of course it's a sign, right? But it doesn't. But what's it taps into right, like our social conversation at the moment. And a lot of these get thrown around. So, I mean, if you go on Twitter at all, like you see just tons of these comments that are, I mean, Twitter is basically just like throwing signs at each other. So
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So it's pretty bad, right? Because you can't explain, right? You say something like, wash your hands, save lives. Or, you use a hashtag, stay the fuck home or something like that. And these are like ways that we try to we try to build in these moral implications into catchphrases that push people to do something. Now, you might say, well, it's a good thing to wash your hands. Absolutely. We would all agree, yeah, we should wash our hands, especially right now, because you don't want to spread the coronavirus. But like, it's the moral implication that if you don't, then you're responsible for murder, for killing. That seems the problematic aspect.
Right. And I mean, your example with the doctor was really good. And we can have the extremes, I think, in this discussion make sense. If for example, if you know you have the coronavirus and you are coughing in your hand and intentionally going out to try and get people sick, that clearly falls within the realm of you are being irresponsible and you have not followed your duty. But then there's a whole spectrum of other cases in between there that don't seem so clear. Miriam, I cut you off. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that this sign, wash your hands, save lives, it was very true in the hospitals just after they discovered bacteria and viruses. So then it was actually very, very true. So what did I want to say with that? I wanted to say the situation, like the applicability of certain that they also change, and they're also very context specific. And
beautiful. Yeah. Awesome. That's a great point, that the context in which these moral actions play out is significant. It's not insignificant, at least, to determining the moral value of these actions.
I mean, the context, it's the context is maybe this is a way to think about it. Is that context, moral judgment. So whether or not somebody has committed something morally wrong is context is relevant in that judgment. So you can't decide whether or not somebody has done something wrong. Right? That is, whether or not they are deserving of blame without relevant moral context.
Yes.
So then when a sign just says, wash your hands, save lives, it implies a moral blame if you don't, but it doesn't have context, right? So then everybody's like potentially guilty and worthy of blame, even though we don't know the context.
So I can imagine
today, Corona is the context. So that is why we have these signs, because everyone who doesn't wash their hands before they go out and touch things, or
So this is this is like a side track here, but this is super interesting what you just said, Josh. I mean, I could imagine, for example, I'll throw out a thought experiment here that's implausible, but that's what's great about thought experiments. They don't need to be realistic. I mean, let's say that you're a doctoral student who's been spending the last 3 months, and you've just been working on your computer, writing away, editing. You haven't been following the news at all. You don't have friends in contact with. You have no idea what's going on in society, right? And one day you decide, when you finish up your dissertation, send it off, you go to the school, you start to or you go into the bathroom and you see this sign that says washing hands saves lives. There's no more context or information, right? And you think it's strange, and you don't wash your hands, right? Because you don't like being told what to do, for example. No, you're ignorant of the situation going on, right? So in some sense, you don't have the same responsibility as someone who knew this. But there's also, John Stuart Mill has this great example about someone who's intoxicated, inebriated, right? Who's not completely responsible for his actions. But Mill says, but he is responsible for getting drunk.
Yeah.
So there is moral responsibility somewhere in the chain. And I'm wondering where moral responsibility plays in there with respect to the person who might talk about being ignorant, or maybe not really understanding what the coronavirus is or how it's spread. And are we then able to blame those people, maybe not necessarily for washing their hands, but for being ignorant of the situation? Or where does blame, praise, responsibility fit into this dynamic? I'm just making things really complicated.
Yeah, I love that. That is, it is really complicated. And I was thinking about this information and keeping yourself informed, which is now more difficult than ever, because everybody is saying there are so many. My general rule for myself is to listen to as many different voices as possible, and then have a feel about what seems to resonate and what seems likely and true and what I'm going to do. And then I base my action on that. So I have, for instance, bought vitamin C.
Sure.
But with the internet, for instance, the internet. When I think about the internet, I think, oh, it's sort of society's, the universe's or whatever's way to make sure that we can never again say, I didn't know. You know?
Yeah, right.
But now we have the situation where we know, we don't know, we have to find out what we know, what it means to know something. Because like the facts and information and knowledge and the knowing how and the knowing what, these are so, I mean, it's so extra difficult on all levels right now.
So
especially like how are we supposed to choose what to do? Like how do we pick the best action right now?
Yeah. This is a really good point, because it raises that there's a moral dimension and there's a epistemological dimension,
right.
Knowledge. So, and really, like think of a sign that's probably a little bit more accurate to the actual case, which would be something like this: like, wash your hands to reduce your risk of infecting somebody else if you have the virus by a certain percentage, right? But and then you are but that's a very interesting sign, right?
Yeah, it's not going to lead to any concrete action, probably.
And well, yeah, not to lead to concrete action. And then there's another layer of that, and that is that we still don't know for sure what the likelihood is of spreading the virus. We don't know very much about it, and there's a lot of conflicting information from different experts. And so, if you say you have a duty to know, so part of moral responsibility is if you know. So Matthew, your example, right, of the PhD student stuck in his closet who comes out and doesn't know, then we would presumably hold him less or her less responsible because they don't know. But then when it comes to the internet, like you were just pointing out, Miriam, is that a lot of information, but of course information is not the same thing as knowledge. There's a lot of information and there's conflicting information. So what is your responsibility in finding out the right information and then how you apply that? And that becomes extra complicated when you have something that is so talked about for one, and so new and not understood, and conflicting information, and that leads to people trying to change their behavior in some way and then you get these moral overtones.
Right.
You to wash your hands and save lives, damn it.
I mean, the epistemological issue is super interesting, though, because how much knowledge do you have to have in order to then say that you have been responsible in understanding the issues? I mean, right after this sign came out, you'll find this hilarious, but right after this sign came out, in the community email thread of the school, there broke out this massive argument between the different teachers about if you have a responsibility to wash your hands, you also have a duty to use the alcohol on your hands as well. And then there was this big discussion about whether or not that works to get rid of viruses, and people were throwing out different websites and citing different sources, and people getting back and forth. In the end, it just led to a bunch of confusion about the issue of, well, should you actually use hand sanitizer or not? It wouldn't hurt, maybe, but it's maybe not necessary. But I mean, things got really confused there. So the question is, if I want to answer that question, how much research do I have to do into hand sanitizers and how effective they are in getting rid of viruses and so on and so forth? It gets to be quite crazy after a while.
I have a point. I thought I had 2 points, but now I realize it's the same one. I just read a book called On Truth by Simon Blackburn, who also wrote the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy. Lovely book. And he says one of his main points there is that instead of looking at the truth of a situation or something as the end product, or like the sum of the facts, or whether the facts were true, you should the measure of truth is your method and methodology for finding out truth. And philosophy is, of course, one such method, that you ask what implications, and then you do, for instance, a thought experiment, which is a philosophical tool. So so if you follow, for instance, the the people who say that you should act as if you have the coronavirus, but you're without symptoms. Maybe you will never have symptoms, and you should act as if you have that, because and that as if corona was extremely infectious, so infectious that you have never heard of anything that infectious, which means that even if you have, you walked past someone who coughed a little bit, so that you got it on your pants, and then you touch a little bit like this, and so if you behave like this, what you will do is something like keep 2 meters away from people, and you will wear gloves when you open doors, and then when you take them off, you will do a certain thing, So that is a thought experiment which will affect your behavior in a way that will save people if these facts are true. But finding out the facts is not what you need to do first. That comes after. You see what I'm saying? So it's not like we need to know how infectious it is before.
Right, but let me jump in here though. But so when we are even jumping into the praxis, our praxis is already theory laden, and
Yes.
what I mean by that is this is so fascinating. We're on Sweden right now. Sweden's taken a rather moderate position in this issue. If you look at Denmark, Norway, they've completely shut down their countries.
Weeks ago.
Weeks ago. So the interesting thing is, if we're looking. Let's look at this issue from a consequentialist perspective. From one approach, one model, we can say, let's take the most conservative approach possible because we will cut down on sickness and death, and that will lead to good consequences. But that's also a very narrow view of what good consequences means. There are also other massive consequences that are playing out here. There's economic consequences, but what I think is actually more important is the sort of social consequences of what happens when we shut ourselves down and isolate ourselves in. Those also need to be taken into account. So sure, we could go to the massive extreme in order to try and avoid certain bad consequences, and thereby actually lead to having much worse consequences in some sense. And I don't want to trivialize anyone who's gotten sick, anyone who's lost a loved one, because in that situation, of course, that is the worst possible thing that can happen. But if you want to take a utilitarian consequentialist approach and look at the broader society, it's a lot more complex than just looking at sickness and taking a conservative model. And that makes the actions, and especially governmental actions, far more complicated.
Isn't it funny? Yeah, how in Sweden, the conservatives want a more strict approach to how we should act, and in the States it's the Democrats, not the Republicans. Isn't it funny? So it's almost like it's we want to do what the government is not doing.
Well, I guess that makes sense, right? Like any if you and this is like another different layer, right? But
Totally.
Yeah.
But go with it.
If you think about the political process, right? The whoever's not in power is going to be interested in trying to see the situation in the worst light for whoever's in power. So that kind of makes sense that you're gonna be trying to see how you would do the situation better, and that's always easier when you're not in the position of having to make those choices. Yeah, but I was thinking that consequentialist view raises. The epistemological question comes up again, and one of the problems with consequentialism in some ways is how you determine the consequences and what you bring in. So seeing the future, exactly. And this, oftentimes, at least it seems to me, like the sign and other statements in the public about coronavirus have a consequentialist framework because that's the most common framework that people use. So, but it is problematic, exactly like you just pointed out, Matthew, because what do you measure? How long do you measure? And how do you know? And that's part of the whole problem with this whole thing. We just don't know, and you don't know what's going to happen. So then you can't base your consequentialist ethics, what you should do today, on anything concrete, because you don't know what's going to happen and you can't measure those, and it's hard to balance these different goods against each other. So greater social distance, for how long, at what cost? It's all those kinds of questions that come up. At what cost?
Right.
You lose other goods.
Gets incredibly complicated.
One cost is stress, and if you want to put it that way, the effect stress has on the immune system.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, I've never been so sick since the coronavirus came out, and that's partly probably because I'm paying more attention to small colds and things like that, right? And it's affected my actions in really concrete ways that haven't necessarily helped my social life or work life or the rest of that, right?
Or your overall flourishing. Yeah. But like every afternoon for a short while, I wonder if I have corona, and I start to feel like, yeah.
But it is interesting. I think there's a number of other interesting layers, just to add some other layers because it's fun. There's an interesting layer in terms of the way that information is communicated in our society. So one way is through the internet, through the media, and so on. And then you have scientific endeavors. You have media that translates that information to others. Then you have politics, and you have the generals or social people talking back and forth, and the way the information spreads. There's so many dimensions of this, because some groups say we should, that is, there's a moral dimension, right? We should do X. Others say we should do this, and then back and forth just becomes crazy.
Everybody wants to tell other people what to do.
Yeah.
Joshua, I like your point of pointing to some other layers. Maybe this is a good way to start, maybe eventually rounding off this discussion, but can we go around a bit and say maybe some potential issues, other areas that we see at work here that possibly are relevant to the discussion? You named some of them with information. I like that you brought in epistemology, what we know, that's significant in this issue. Miriam, do you have anything that you've been thinking about?
The meaning of it all.
The existential part of it, the
existential part, and what I'm always thinking about, what am I learning, and how can I grow from this, and how can I help other people grow in this? That's what I'm mostly thinking about.
Something that we haven't really got into, and that's a whole nother discussion I'm thinking about, is if we are talking about a duty in society, though, what happens when we don't follow the duty? How is this enforced? What kind of authority is used? Is it used properly to enforce this? Issues of freedom, liberty come in. I'm surprised this hasn't come up more in America, this discussion. But that's something I think that's also in the background here, is the idea of how we should understand enforcement. One other thing I think is really interesting is the idea of sort of collective responsibility. The way that Denmark, for example, can talk about Sweden.
Yes.
There's a sense in which there's a collective entity, a collective agent of Denmark that is making a moral judgment about the collective agent of Sweden. How does that work in relation to individuals, in relation to governments? What's that dynamic look like? How do we understand the moral issues there? That seems like a whole nother track.
What is a government? What is authority and personal responsibility?
Yeah.
Super interesting. Interesting.
To sort of add to that, I would say, I think that the epistemological issue is really interesting in terms of how we. So there's always there's a lot of talk about evidence-based policy, right?
Right.
But there's problems with evidence and there's problems with policy, right? So we, especially in this case, we don't have enough evidence but we have to make policy decisions quickly. So that there's like an epistemological aspect. I think that issue of government that you kind of pointed out, Matthew, would be something about surveillance. And I think building in systems for certain intended consequences, good consequences. We want to make sure people don't move around too much. So we're going to track their cell phone data to make sure that they're not moving too much. You might build a system for good purposes at the moment, and then that system could be used for the opposite purposes later, right? So, and this is unintended consequences, and this actually relates back. So this is a good way to tie it all off, actually, because this relates back to the sign. The sign says, "Wash your hands and save lives," and there's a causal relationship between the two implied. And one of the problems with causal relationships is that we oftentimes don't know what the causal relationship is. So there's unintended consequences. We might put in a policy as a government to take care of corona, which sets the groundwork for the next process of government that will be end up being horrific. So you might have unintended consequences by building a system that leads to awful things, even though you built it to solve this problem.
Yeah. Right.
It has happened before in history.
It has happened before in history, yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. And we shouldn't, obviously shouldn't forget that.
And that's exactly why I think, Josh, that point, I'll just throw this last little one in there, it's why it's so important to remain critical of the discussions, the discourse, how things are playing out, for exactly that reason, that in times of crisis, in times when people are vulnerable, power structures can push through a lot of things that are immoral or not necessarily beneficial to us. Yeah. And that's when philosophers are needed, I think, to stand up and raise some important questions. So that'll be my last word.
Any last thoughts, Miriam?
Yes, I'll just sort of sign that too. So we want to raise questions. We don't want to be three more people who say this is what philosophers would do and then recommend a course of action. That's not our job. It's just to say, what does it mean? What does it mean when they say this, when they do this? That's what we want to do.
And so then I'll just tie it off. And what it means is relevant to how our society works. So it's important.
Yes. Word.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we can say thank you to all of you guys, and thank you to the viewers who are able to watch this and join us in this discussion. Hopefully we'll have more of these coming up in the future.
Absolutely.
It's our choice. We can choose to do them.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.